Hi, I'm Pastor Sarah, and I'm so glad that you've joined us for this week's family learning video. As a reminder, each week we email out a one-page family learning guide that has questions for you to think about as a parent and also for you to talk about with your child, as well as some learning activities and a prayer focus. You can find that on our website. You can also get added to our mailing list, and we send those out with our Sunday worship mailing list, our Sunday worship information every Friday afternoon. Well, this week we're continuing our sermon series on the parables, and we're talking about Jesus's parable of the workers in the vineyard. Now, this parable, like all of Jesus's parables, sounds simple enough, but it's actually really challenging. I invite you to check out the parable at Matthew chapter 20, starting at verse 1, going through till verse 16, and it's also our sermon topic and our worship topic for Sunday. So you can learn more about it by checking out the sermon. So I won't rehash the sermon, but this passage is about fairness, and it's about how God's sense of fairness and justice is not ours. This is particularly challenging and important for us to know in a world that is so achievement-oriented, a world in which good grades, being very active in school for kids is often what we reinforce as they prepare to go to college. Going to a good college or go to a good trade school or having preparation for whatever career they want will help them to get a good job, which will in turn help them to be stable. Everything is about achievement. The very way in which we talk about things like the American dream reinforce for ourselves and for our children that hard work pays off. But that's not how God's grace works. It's also not how the world always works either. We often try to make God's grace and our salvation about success in the same way that success is other places. So as much as we push children to do their best in school, maybe even to meet certain grades in school, we often think about that and maybe even teach our children that our salvation is the same. We say we believe in God's grace, and yet we often live as though we believe that our salvation depends on us doing the right things, serving enough, doing enough. And so we find ourselves, honestly, sometimes on a hamster wheel, or maybe we've fallen off the hamster wheel and we live in guilt because we just can't keep up. We can't do as much as other people are. Maybe we do find ourselves proud of what we're able to achieve, and we see other people and think, well, clearly though, God would reward me more. That's what we think, but that's not the point of this parable. This parable Jesus offers to his disciples, those who, as Peter says in the verses just before this parable, have given up everything to follow Jesus. Then Peter says, then what do we get? And that's the same response that we have. What do we get? As you talk with your children this week, as you think about what this means as a parent, especially in a world in which maybe your kids have chore lists, they have expectations that you have for schoolwork or for behavior, being able to help think through yourself and help talk with your kids about what grace really looks like, unearned grace. Even if it's saying, all of these things, these ways that we have expectations of working our best and doing a good job, that's important. But I want you to know that that's not how God works. If we set up a framework for our children that teaches them that they have to do all the best things, do all the right things, or else they might lose God's love, then we've undercut the ability of God's grace to be truly present in their life. Maybe you felt that in your own life. Maybe you've been taught that being a follower of Jesus Christ is about really earning God's love. It's not. Our parable today is about God's grace. It's not so much about God's extravagant generosity. If that were the case, then those hired at the end of the day would get a denarian, and those hired at the beginning of the day would get even more than they were promised. And there are places in Scripture that talk about God's grace in that way, but the parable today reminds us that the way in which we evaluate what we deserve or what we should have is not the same as the way that God works. And in the face of disciples who wanted to know that they would be rewarded for the sacrifices that they had made, Jesus essentially goes, that's not the way that God's grace works. Everybody has the ability to receive grace and salvation from God. And you're not more loved by God if you've done more, because God's love is extravagant. It's extravagant to everybody. And so if we try to trust ourselves and not God's grace, then we'll end up just getting what we've earned. And as salvation goes, that's not very much. As you talk with your kids, as school starts, this also is a time to think about how you judge what's important, especially this fall as our children head back to school. Maybe you're a teacher, you probably know teachers. There is a lot of anxiety and stress. So many of the ways that we have judged success before are going to be really challenging. The ways that our teachers have taught are going to be difficult, whether it's online virtual learning, whether we have hybrid learning. For a lot of this year, whatever the decisions that school systems, families, and teachers make, many of the metrics that we've used to define success are going to be really challenging. Students who were able to get really good grades before may find it more difficult. Some students may thrive or do better in this setting. I invite you with your children, as we think about what the metrics and what the gauges of success are, and as we enter a new school year, I invite you to talk with your children, whatever age they are, whatever grade they are, to talk with them about what the three most important metrics or gauges that you as a family are going to hold for them this school year. Maybe that's grades. Maybe it's completing all of their work. Just completing all of their work with online learning is going to take a focus and commitment on its own. Maybe you're going to talk about what it means to do their best job, to do the best work. Maybe you're going to talk about what you'll be looking for resiliency. Maybe you're going to talk with them about what you're committing as a parent or as a guardian or grandparent, how you're committing to support them. At the end of the year, how will you look back on the year and say, this was a successful year. This was a good year. We did a good job. The metrics that you've used before may not work this year. And so if you enter into this year and try to operate the way that you have before, you'll probably be really frustrated. And your children may be also. Helping your children think through what healthy, appropriate, and goals that push them might be will be really important to do as you start the year, so that you don't find yourself frustrated, feeling like you can't do anything right. Think through what truly is most important to you. And with your child, set goals and measures and make sure that you check in, if not every day, then each week, to see how those things are going. Be gracious with your child. Be gracious with your children's teachers. Be gracious with yourself. Do what you need to do to take care of yourself, knowing as you learn on an airplane, you've got to put your own mask on first, right? You've got to put your own mask on first. Care for yourself so that you can be present and patient with your children, even if that means you need to step away for a time. God's grace is poured out on us unearned. And if we're willing to wholly throw ourselves on God's grace, then we are able to receive. If we're able to put our trust and our faith, then we're able to receive God's grace. This parable is good news, but only if we're willing to trust in God's grace and not on our own accomplishments to receive that grace. I hope that you have a grace-filled week. I hope that you see God's love poured out on you in ways that you can hardly imagine. And I hope that as you and your children and your family head into a new school year, that you are able to be excited about some things that you can look forward to, some goals that you have set, and the ways in which we'll be able to look back on this year and be proud of the resiliency, of the strength, and of the ways that we've shown and of the ways that we have cared well for each other.